I think it's difficult to tell any story right now without thinking about the climate crisis. You know, the climate for me, in the same way as I think about the natural world, this is the breakdown of the natural world. This is what we live in. This is every environment.
This series of Artists' Ideas Now is talking to artists from Egypt and of Egyptian heritage about the climate crisis and the issues and narratives that interweave with it. I'm Laura Marie Brown, creative producer at Liverpool Arab Arts Festival and host of this series. Adham Faramawy is an artist of Egyptian heritage based in London. Their work spans media including moving image, sculptural installation and print, thinking through issues of materiality, touch and toxic embodiment to questions of the natural in relation to marginalised communities. We talked about their body of work and how those themes within their work weave together and how art plays a role in creating a greater level of awareness that everything around us is natural. Sensuality and touch is a core tenet of their work, and I began by asking how that began.
This was something to do with being far away from the people that I care about. So much of the intimacy that I experience in my life is through screens. And so there's, you know, as a migrant person who lives very far from their family, and as a queer person whose romance and intimacy and social friendships is conducted through apps, I wanted to talk about this issue of lack, of the unrequited, of the inability to touch. And I was doing that initially through performance for camera videos where I was staging, I was taking this footage of dancers and performers moving and behaving in particular ways and using it as a sculptural medium to think about the objecthood of the screen and how solid it is and what it is as a barrier, and how the image positions the viewer and what it asks of them, who it asks them to be. You know, what's the subject position that it engenders? Who do you have to be to take in this image? And where else does that happen? You know, like what other images ask you to be a particular person to consume them? So that was maybe my entry point into thinking about touch. Like, why would you think about touch so deeply? Like, why is it so important to you? Something that should maybe be banal, or, you know, something that you do every day. It's because I don't actually, you know, it's because the people that I love are so far from me. So I wanted to think about it a bit.
One of your pieces is By Earth, Sea and Air We Came. It interweaves kind of migration, about nature and animals together. Will you talk a little bit about this work and kind of the inspiration behind it, and how I kind of feel like what we've talked about already, that kind of work is sort of all of those themes kind of coming together?
Yeah, By Earth, Sea and Air We Came is a video I made thinking about the different lives that live around the River Lee, which is a river in East London. I think it leads from Hertfordshire all the way through London into East London, and it's a tributary of the Thames. And I live quite near it. It's near my studio, and I cycle up and down it. So I started thinking about what lives here, what were the histories, what were the stories and the mythologies of this place. And I found so many stories, and I found some of the roots of some of the communities that I live within and alongside in East London along this river. You know, I found one of its early names, that it's an old Celtic god, and I found some of that god's stories, the bright river of the god Lugus, and I found different plants and flowers, and I found the London parakeets living along which I made into a different video to think about how they got to London through as a coveted Victorian pet that came through colonial trade routes. And I also found the Lascar sailors, who were Indian sailors who ran British colonial ships. And Lascar is, as far as I know, it's rooted in an Arabic word, askari, askar. It means soldier. So they were respected in their communities, but on the British ships, on the English naval ships that they ran, they were retained on really unfavourable contracts. So they were paid a fraction of what British sailors would get, and we know that being a sailor was a dangerous job. It's not something that you think, oh, a British sailor, oh, that's someone who's they might be naval heroes, but they weren't kept in sanitary conditions or fed well or paid well. So think what happens when you're paid a fraction of that and made to live physically underneath everyone else. But then also, when they got to London at the Docklands, which is where the River Lee meets the Thames, they were just left there. The British government wanted them to leave, but they couldn't. There was no money. They weren't paid often. There was, so it's one of these early instances of bureaucracy and contracts being used and weaponized against people of color. And it turns out, because of this, are some of the first people of color around the Docklands, alongside, the first Chinatown and the Lascars. They're one of the first Asian communities. And I wanted really to think about, as a North African Arab and an Egyptian, how, I live here and I live alongside these communities. I'm not necessarily within them, but often I'm flattened into other migrant communities just by virtue of being raised Muslim and, and living nearby. But so I was kind of thinking about those things.
Which kind of ties into that, the piece, the heart wants what the heart wants, and that sense of how the stories of marginalised communities aren't preserved in the same way a lot of the time because of, language and because of colonialism, but that sense of how you retain those stories and how you preserve them and keep telling them to people as well.
It's an interesting one. The Heart Wants What the Heart Wants was supposed to be my first live performance piece with a group called Art Night, and it was going to happen on the Strand. So I this is before developing it fully. It was meant to be live. But then COVID happened, and so I decided to make a performance for camera video, and I shot it nearby on the Wanstead Flats, which is where I've been shooting quite a lot of my videos. It's a nature reserve near my home in Newham. And so, again, I was thinking about some of the communities that I live in, but also some of the reasons that those communities can't exist in the same ways where my family live, and also some of the hidden stories within my family and also just regionally, and some of the language forms that exist. So it explores some of those. I felt really under a lot of pressure when I was writing that script, because the performance for camera videos I make, they're often structured around a monologue where I tell stories literally just in my own voice. So I've been scripting these stories. And I just felt really narcissistic and uncomfortable because I was quite maybe a little bit overly open when I was talking in the first person. I tell a lot of very personal stories in these videos, and I just felt very uncomfortable about how I kept saying I this, I that, me. So I took it to an artist friend of mine who brought up. She reminded me of the book Fox and Their Friends Between Revolutions, which is a seminal queer American book from San Francisco, and how so many of the characters in that are named after flowers and, you know, fruits and vegetables and animals, a lot like, you know, the radical fairy community. And, you know, she said, what happens when you change the first person into the third person? And she talked about all the different stories of plants and herbs that are in the and trees that are in the video. So, you know, I became chamomile and dragonwort and cespin, so that I could tell these stories. So, you know, just to create enough distance between me and the subject of the story to be able to tell it. And a number of although the plants that I talk about in the story are ones that you find in the nature reserve in East London, the names that I name the characters in these stories are the English name of flowers and herbs used in ancient Egyptian funerary practices. And some of those are native indigenous Egyptian plants. Some of them arrived in Egypt, you know, via trade with the Levant, you know, with Palestine, with you know, southern Turkey and sort of Asia Minor, which I was hoping kind of drew out the spectre of grief that was present from some previous videos.
I'm going to come on to talk about the climate crisis, because nature plays such a vital role in your work and is a character of constant. But of course, because of the climate crisis, it is constantly changing and in many ways deteriorating. How does that play in your work, to have such a character that gives you so much solace and seems so interwoven with your identity? How does the climate crisis play a role in that?
I think it's difficult to tell any story right now without thinking about the climate crisis. You know, the climate for me, in the same way as I think about the natural world, this is the breakdown of the natural world. This is what we live in. This is every environment that humans live in. We're part of it. We're responsible for it, and we're very much right in the middle of it. So how is it possible to tell a story outside of that? You know, it's there. It's just there. And it feels like a responsibility for me to have that conversation over and over and over until some solutions are found. I don't think that artists have the greatest influence or control over any situation, but I think that we have a responsibility to use whatever platform and attention we get to talk about something this important. If I can affect how someone feels about something, and that's the only influence I have, then I'm going to try.
Let's talk a little bit about the Daughters of River, which was at the Serpentine, and it tackles the theme of queer earth and liquid matters. Talk a little bit about that and how that sort of manifested and how you felt about it.
So, as I said, I've been working with performance and performers for a number of years, but always for video. Performance for camera. So Daughters of the River was my first live work where the heart wants what the heart wants didn't manifest as a live work. This did, and it incorporated spoken word and dance and live music, as well as video projection. And I tried to draw on histories, mythologies and fictions around the River Thames and its tributaries, especially after the work done around the River Lee, to tell the stories of the romances and the toxicities of the waterways that shape me. So I talk about the Thames, its tributary rivers that have mostly been buried underground and incorporated into part of the sewage network. And how that sewage system was initially built in response to the ecological disaster called the Great Stink of 1858, which was so disgusting that it closed down the Houses of Parliament. And through mythology, described a link between the Thames and one of the other great rivers that shaped me, the Nile. And it turns out that there was a medieval revision of a story where Old Father Tame, the personification of the Thames, married the Great Mother, the goddess Isis, whose cult was brought over to England from Egypt by the Romans, creating the Tamasis, which is one of the old words and still is the Greek word for the Thames. And that takes us to Egypt to talk about historical attitudes to the river. You know, the ancient Egyptians, you know, when we died, we were asked by the judges, did you pollute the waters of the Nile? You know, did you kill, did you steal, did you pollute the waters of the Nile? And that would be one of the questions that determined whether your heart was as light as a feather and whether you could go on to the, you know, to the after the place, to the field of reeds. So the work also talks about, or it uses that to start talking about contemporary and colonial conditions of the river and the political and ecological ramifications of the Great Dam of Aswan. You know, the how Lake Nasser was flooded, how it moved or displaced nearly the entirety of the Nubian population in the south in Upper Egypt. How Egypt has been using, in the past kind of 5 to 10 years, they've been using colonial treaties to influence the building of a new dam in Ethiopia. So it's a complex work, just kind of trying to think about water and waterways and how they shape me as a person.
I think one of the things I'm getting from talking to you, and I'm so glad you're part of this series, is how when you have mixed heritage and mixed identities, your experience is so much broader to bring different stories together from so many different, you know, corners of the world, from just purely by your sort of lived experience. And I think that's one of the reasons why, you know, artists from different communities have such a vital role to play in the conversation around the climate crisis. One of the things we've always found whenever we talk to artists to say, we want you to talk about the climate crisis, so many of them, and this is, you know, from mostly Arab artists that we work with, will say, oh, my work isn't on the climate crisis. Oh, I don't do that. And you're like, no, it is. It's about the conflict. It's about the legacy of colonialism. How do we give artists more confidence to feel they have a sense of agency to talk about the climate crisis?
So many of the challenges that we live within, the oppressions that we live under, are interconnected and affect each other. And so as a migrant person, I feel like one of the important things that I do with the work is to talk about complicity and to make it very clear that I understand myself as living within systems and not outside them. So often artists, or I've been invited as an artist to speak from something as a commentator from outside, and actually that position doesn't work for me. I'm a person, I have a job, I pay taxes, I'm the same as anyone else. My perspective isn't any more important or valuable than anyone doing any other job. But, you know, to an extent, my job is telling stories. And as we were saying before, like, stories change the way stories are a way to share information. They're a way to share histories. They're a way to share ideas and positions. They're also a way to change how people feel about things. And, you know, changing how someone feels about something, maybe that affects how they make decisions about stuff.
Artists' Ideas Now is produced by Liverpool Arab Arts Festival in collaboration with Artists on the Front Line. This series was supported by The Space and Arts Council England, with funding from the National Lottery. The producers are Laura Marie Brown and Zoe Lafferty. Executive producer is Sarah Fortescue. The series music is by Yara McAway and is called Feed on Wasted Energy from her LP 1963. For more information on this series and to find out more about each of the artists featured, go to arabartsfestival.com and explore the reading list for each episode.